16 years into her marriage, nothing dramatic happened. No screaming. No cheating. No sudden betrayal. Just a Tuesday morning. At exactly 6:12 a.m., she stood alone in a kitchen larger than most people's apartments. Rinsing a mug that wasn't hers. Not washing it. Just rinsing it. Because habits like that are easier than questions. And somewhere between that chipped mug and the quiet hum of a house paid for in full, she realized something that terrified her. She had everything people envy. And none of the things that make a life feel like it belongs to you. Have you ever woken up one day and realized the life you worked so hard to build no longer recognizes you? Have you ever stayed in a relationship not because you were happy, but because leaving felt ungrateful? Because from the outside, her marriage looked perfect. 16 years. Financial security. A husband who provided. A life most people pray for. But inside that silence lived a truth she could no longer rinse away. Love had become maintenance. And she had become invisible. Today's story isn't about betrayal. It's about the slow erosion that happens when comfort replaces connection. When silence feels safer than honesty. And when a woman must decide whether staying is worth losing herself. So before we continue, if you believe love stories should teach us something about life, dignity, and emotional truth, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. These are the kinds of stories we tell here. Because what happens next will force her to confront a question many people avoid for decades. What do you do when staying costs your dignity? And leaving costs your comfort? This is the story of how, after years of being married, she chose dignity over wealth. She noticed the clock only because it was too quiet. 6:12 a.m. The numbers glowed softly above the stove, their blue light reflected in the polished counters and the stainless steel appliances that never seemed to show fingerprints. The house was awake in the way expensive houses always were, systems running, air circulating, something humming faintly behind the walls, but no one else was. She held the mug under the faucet and let the water run in a slow circle along the rim. Not enough pressure to splash, just enough to rinse away the thin brown ring left from yesterday's coffee. She turned it once, thumb tracing the chip at the lip. The porcelain caught slightly against her skin, familiar enough that she didn't flinch. She had learned that mornings went better if she moved quietly, as if the house itself might resent being disturbed too early. She didn't know when that habit had started. Somewhere along the way, she had begun to treat the silence as something fragile. The mug was his. He liked it because it was heavy, because it stayed warm longer. She had suggested replacing it once, years ago, after the chip appeared. "It's fine," he'd said without looking up. "I like it." So she rinsed it. Every morning. Even on days he wasn't home. Even on days she didn't drink coffee at all. She set the mug upside down in the drying rack, aligning it so the handle faced outward. Order mattered. Small correctness mattered. They gave shape to the space where conversation used to be. She leaned her hip against the counter and listened. The house responded with the quiet clicks and sighs of settling metal. Somewhere upstairs, a vent exhaled. The refrigerator adjusted its pitch. These sounds had become so familiar that she noticed their absence more than their presence. She tried, without meaning to remember the last morning she'd woken up laughing. Not smiling. Laughing. The memory didn't come easily. There were images, sunlight through curtains, the warmth of another body beside her, but they refused to organize themselves into a moment she could trust. They felt edited, like scenes recalled from a story told too many times. 16 years was a long time to share a life with someone. Long enough that beginnings lost their sharpness. Long enough that endings felt theoretical, like storms predicted but never seen. She moved through the kitchen, straightening a chair that hadn't been pulled out, wiping a spot from a surface that was already clean. These gestures were reflexive now. Proof of presence. Proof that she still knew how to tend to things. When they were first married, mornings had been different. Messier. Louder. He would come into the kitchen half awake, hair sticking up, already talking about something he'd read or an idea he'd had in the shower. She would listen, barefoot, coffee cooling in her hands, amused by his certainty. He always seemed to know what came next. That was one of the things she'd loved most about him. He moved through the world as if it made sense. She, on the other hand, had grown up learning to read between lines. To notice tone shifts. To adjust before problems became visible. Her childhood had taught her that peace was something you maintained, not something you assumed. When she met him, his confidence felt like permission to rest. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. He didn't ask the kinds of questions that kept her awake at night. Being near him felt like standing next to a wall, solid, unmoving, reliable. At least that's how she remembered it. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly, the coolness grounding her. She wondered, not for the first time, how much of her memory was accurate, and how much was shaped by what she needed to believe back then. Memory had a way of smoothing rough edges, especially when admitting the truth would mean admitting you'd stayed too long. They had met through mutual friends at a small dinner party. Nothing dramatic. No lightning strike. He'd sat across from her, asked thoughtful questions, listened without interrupting. When he spoke about his plans, they were specific. Timelines, milestones, contingencies. He talked about the future as if it were something you could build with enough discipline. She'd found that comforting. In the early years, he made her feel chosen. Not swept away, not consumed, but selected. As if he had looked at all the possible lives available to him, and decided this one made the most sense. At the time, she didn't realize how much that framing mattered. The first real crack hadn't felt like a crack at all. It had felt like maturity. Busy schedules replaced long conversations. Plans replaced spontaneity. They told themselves it was normal, even healthy, to settle into rhythms. She believed that love evolved, that intensity gave way to stability, and that stability was something to be grateful for. Gratitude became a language she spoke fluently. When he worked late, she told herself it was because he was building something for them. When he forgot small things, dates, preferences, the way she took her tea, she told herself those were details, not indicators. When he listened with a furrowed brow and responded with solutions instead of comfort, she reminded herself that everyone loved differently. She became very good at translating his intentions. The house grew larger, quieter, filled with objects chosen by professionals who asked her what she liked, and nodded thoughtfully before presenting options that all felt equally distant. She learned the vocabulary of finishes and fabrics, learned how to approve decisions without feeling attached to them. There was always something arriving, something being upgraded, something being optimized. She told herself that ease created space for tenderness. Sometimes it did. Often, it created space for avoidance. She finished her water and rinsed the glass, setting it beside the mug. For a moment, she imagined leaving it there, unrinsed, just to see what would happen. The thought surprised her with its sharpness, as if rebellion could be measured in residue. She dried her hands on a towel and stood still. There were questions she didn't ask herself anymore. They hovered at the edges of her awareness, familiar enough to be ignored. Questions like, when did I stop being lonely and start being quiet? Or worse, had she ever stopped at all? It wasn't that she was unhappy in any obvious way. That was the problem. Unhappiness implied failure, neglect, wrongdoing. None of those applied cleanly. Their marriage worked. It functioned. It was admired. People said things like, "You're so lucky," and she smiled, because explaining the difference between luck and fulfillment felt indulgent. She picked up her phone and scrolled without seeing, letting other people's lives flicker past. Milestones. Announcements. Carefully framed joy. She wondered how many of those images were rinsed versions of something more complicated. Upstairs, a door closed softly. The sound landed in her chest before she realized what it was. He was awake. She felt the familiar tightening, the quick mental inventory. Was there something she needed to say? Something she should avoid? She hated that her body prepared itself before her mind did. Footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. He appeared in the doorway, already dressed, already focused, his attention divided between the screen in his hand and the day ahead. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. He glanced at the counter, at the mug in the rack. "Thanks." It was a small word. Genuine. Insufficient. He moved past her, already talking about a meeting, a timeline, a delay that needed managing. She listened, nodding in the right places, absorbing information she wouldn't need later. She knew how this exchange would end, with a quick kiss on the cheek, with a promise to talk later, with the sense that something had almost been touched. Later had become a place where feelings went to wait. As he left the room, she looked again at the clock. 6:19 a.m. 7 minutes. Enough time to rinse a mug. Enough time to realize that care, when it goes unrecognized long enough, begins to feel like disappearance. She didn't know it yet, but this ordinary morning, this quiet habit, was already teaching her something she would spend the rest of the year learning how to accept. That staying didn't require cruelty to cost you yourself. Sometimes, all it took was silence. After he left, the house seemed to exhale. It wasn't a dramatic shift. Nothing slammed or echoed. The quiet simply settled back into place, familiar and obedient, like it had been waiting just outside the door. She stood where she was for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the soft absence of him, noticing how quickly her body loosened. That unsettled her. She gathered the things he'd left behind without thinking: his phone charger coiled on the counter, yesterday's jacket draped over the back of a chair. She folded the jacket neatly and placed it where it belonged. The charger went into a drawer, already organized by size and purpose. She was good at this part of life. Good at maintenance. Good at keeping systems running smoothly. She wondered, not for the first time, when love had begun to feel like a responsibility she managed, instead of an experience she shared. The morning light shifted as the sun climbed higher, casting clean lines across the floor. She moved through them slowly, barefoot, her reflection passing briefly across the dark glass of the oven door. For a split second she caught her own eyes and felt a small jolt of recognition, as if she'd interrupted herself doing something private. She looked tired, not exhausted, not worn down, just muted. She couldn't remember when she'd started measuring her days by efficiency rather than feeling, when she'd begun to feel proud of how little she needed, how adaptable she'd become. Those traits had once felt like strengths. Now they felt like evidence. She carried her phone into the living room and sank onto the couch, the leather cool beneath her legs. The room was immaculate in the way spaces curated for admiration often were. Neutral tones, balanced proportions, nothing out of place, nothing that told a story without being prompted. Friends complimented the house often, asked where she found certain pieces. She answered politely, knowing the names of designers, the logic behind each choice. She rarely mentioned that none of it felt like hers. She opened a message thread from her sister and stared at it without typing. The last message read, "How are you really?" She'd meant to answer days ago. How do you explain a life that looks successful but feels strangely hollow? How do you admit that nothing is technically wrong and still feel like something essential is missing? She locked the phone and set it aside. Silence had taught her many things over the years. It taught her how to anticipate moods before they arrived, how to fill space with usefulness, how to become agreeable without feeling dishonest. It taught her that being easy to live with was a form of currency. What it didn't teach her was how to ask for more without feeling like she was asking for too much. She rose and walked toward the window, looking out at the manicured yard. Everything beyond the glass was still, held in place by routine care and careful scheduling. She thought of how many hours of her life had been spent waiting for him to come home, waiting for the right moment to speak, waiting for a version of herself that felt less tentative. She told herself again that this was what adulthood looked like. That passion softened. That expectations matured. That longing was something you learned to manage. But beneath that reasoning lived a quieter truth she had never fully examined. She had mistaken endurance for depth. The realization didn't land all at once. It pressed in gradually, like weather changing. A subtle pressure shift she couldn't ignore anymore. Later that morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook she hadn't opened in years. It had once held lists, goals, reminders, fragments of thoughts she'd meant to return to. She flipped through the pages slowly, noticing how abruptly the entries stopped. One page ended mid-sentence. She traced the unfinished line with her finger. At the time, she'd assumed she was just busy. Life had accelerated. There were commitments to keep, plans to support, adjustments to make. She'd told herself she'd come back to it when things settled. Things had settled. That was the problem. She closed the notebook and rested her hands on top of it, palms flat, as if grounding herself. She thought about the early years again, not nostalgically but analytically. She had always been good at analysis. In the beginning, when he listened, she felt expansive. When he planned, she felt included. But somewhere along the way, listening had turned into processing, and planning had turned into deciding. She hadn't noticed the shift because it wasn't abrupt. It happened the way habits form, through repetition, through small accommodations that feel reasonable in the moment. She'd stopped interrupting, stopped correcting, stopped insisting. Not because she wasn't allowed to, but because it was easier not to. Ease, she was learning, came with a cost. That afternoon, she drove into town for groceries. The parking lot was crowded. The store buzzing with ordinary life. Couples debated brands. Children tugged at sleeves. She moved through the aisles methodically, checking items off a list that lived in her head. At the checkout, the cashier made casual conversation, asked how her day was going. Good, she said automatically. The word felt thin. On the drive home, traffic slowed, forcing her to sit with her thoughts longer than usual. She watched the car ahead of her, its brake lights flickering on and off. She thought about how often she did the same thing, moving forward, stopping, adjusting, without ever changing direction. She realized then that she had been measuring the health of her marriage by the absence of conflict, rather than the presence of connection. That felt like an important distinction. When she arrived home, she carried the groceries inside and set them on the counter. The mug was still in the drying rack, untouched. The sight of it stirred something unexpectedly sharp in her chest. It was such a small object, such an insignificant ritual, and yet it represented years of quiet effort, of care offered without expectation, and received without awareness. She imagined briefly what it would feel like to stop, to leave the mug where it was, to let the chip catch someone else's thumb. The thought scared her, not because it was dramatic but because it felt honest. She put the groceries away and stood alone in the kitchen again, the day stretching ahead of her unstructured. In the past, unstructured time had felt like a luxury. Now it felt like a mirror. She understood something then, not as a conclusion, but as a question she could no longer avoid. What happens to a person when they become so skilled at maintaining peace that they forget how to recognize themselves? The answer wasn't clear yet, but the silence, once protective, had begun to speak. And she was finally listening. If you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, if you've ever told yourself nothing is wrong while feeling something slowly disappear, then this story is already about more than her. Because chapter 1 isn't really about a mug, or a marriage, or even silence. It's about what happens when being adaptable turns into self-erasure. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever mistaken peace for happiness? Let me know in the comments. Your answer might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe love stories should do more than entertain, if they should teach us something real about relationships, dignity, and emotional truth, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. These are the kinds of stories we tell here. In the next chapter, we go back to the beginning. To the man she chose, the safety she felt, and the early moments that taught her to confuse certainty with love. You won't want to miss it. The man she chose. The first time she noticed him, he wasn't speaking. That was what stood out. They were gathered in a narrow dining room that smelled faintly of roasted garlic and something sweet baking in the oven. A friend's apartment. A birthday dinner. Too many people, not enough chairs. She had arrived already tired, already prepared to be pleasant. Years of social calibration had taught her how to take up just enough space without asking for it. He sat across the table, listening. While others talked over one another, opinions colliding, stories competing, he waited. When he finally spoke, his voice cut cleanly through the noise, calm and measured. He didn't rush to be clever. He didn't perform. He answered questions directly, like each one deserved to be considered before being returned. She noticed how people leaned toward him without realizing it. That night, when someone asked what he did for a living, he explained it simply, without embellishment. When someone challenged him, he didn't bristle. He clarified. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be precise. She liked that. It felt different from the men she'd known before, men who filled silence because they feared it, who mistook intensity for depth. With him, silence didn't feel like absence. It felt intentional. When he asked her a question, he waited for the answer. Not politely. Attentively. She found herself saying more than she intended. Not because she was oversharing, but because he made room. He nodded when she spoke, not as a signal to hurry, but as if to say, "I'm following you." It was subtle. It mattered. At the end of the night, as people gathered coats and leftovers, he walked her to the door. No dramatic linger. No forced intimacy. "I like talking with you," he said. "If you ever want to continue the conversation, I'd like that." Not "we should." Not "let's see." Just a clear statement. She agreed before she had time to overthink it. In the days that followed, she replayed the evening in her mind. Not obsessively. Just curiously. She noticed how calm she'd felt around him, how little effort it had taken to be herself. That alone felt remarkable. Their first few dates were unremarkable, in the best way. Coffee, walks, long conversations that unfolded without urgency. He asked about her work, her family, her opinions on things that didn't matter much. He listened for patterns, not just facts. When she spoke about her childhood, she found herself explaining less, filling in fewer gaps. He seemed to understand subtext intuitively. She told him once that she was careful by nature, that she liked to think before she spoke. "That's not careful," he said gently. "That's considerate." The word landed softly, but it stayed. Her upbringing had taught her to manage environments, to sense when a room was shifting and adjust accordingly. She'd learned early that being observant kept things calm. Being calm kept things safe. He didn't seem to require that from her. He knew what he wanted. He knew where he was going. His certainty wasn't loud or rigid, it was steady. When he talked about the future, it wasn't in vague hopes, but in sequences. If this, then that. If not, adjust. She admired that. More than that, she trusted it. There was relief in standing near someone who didn't constantly question the ground beneath their feet. She hadn't realized how much energy she spent doing that herself until she didn't have to anymore. When he proposed, it wasn't elaborate. They were in their apartment. Small, shared, imperfect. He had cooked dinner, overcooked the pasta, apologized and laughed at himself. "I don't want to surprise you," he said, taking her hands. "I want to choose you on purpose." She said yes without hesitation. In the early years of marriage, they were partners in the truest sense. They divided responsibilities efficiently, supported each other's ambitions. When challenges came, and they did, he approached them like puzzles to be solved. She appreciated that about him. Problems felt less overwhelming when he broke them down into manageable parts. When she felt anxious, he reassured her with plans. When she worried about the future, he showed her projections. He didn't dismiss her fears, he answered them with structure. She interpreted that as care. They talked often then. Late into the night, sprawled on the couch, sharing stories about who they had been and who they thought they might become. He told her about his parents, about a father who believed love was demonstrated through provision, about a mother who thanked him for everything, even the expected. "Gratitude matters," he'd said. "People should feel appreciated for what they give." She agreed. It sounded reasonable. It sounded right. She didn't realize then how deeply that belief would shape the way he loved. One night during a storm that knocked out the power, they sat on the floor by candlelight, eating crackers and laughing at the absurdity of it. Rain hammered the windows, loud and insistent, and for a while the world outside shrank to that room. He told her stories from his childhood, his voice warm in the flicker of light. She leaned into him, feeling chosen, protected. She thought, this is what it means to be with someone who knows how to build a life. Years later she would return to that memory often. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it had become a reference point. Proof that intimacy had existed. Evidence she could hold up to herself when doubt crept in. She would wonder, quietly, carefully, whether the warmth she remembered belonged to that moment, or whether she had wrapped it in meaning after the fact. At the time, she didn't question it. Why would she? The marriage worked. They worked. He succeeded, steadily and visibly. She supported him, adapted with him, grew alongside him. When life asked for sacrifices, she made them without resentment. That, she believed, was love. What she didn't see, what she couldn't yet name, was how easily admiration can turn into deference, how subtly certainty can become authority when left unexamined. She mistook his confidence for emotional availability, and by the time she realized the difference, it would already feel familiar enough to be dangerous. Looking back, she could pinpoint the moment she began to rely on his certainty as if it were a resource. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It slipped quietly into the corners of their life, the way dependable things often do. When decisions needed to be made, where to live, when to move, which opportunities to pursue, he had answers ready, not impulsive answers. Considered ones. He ran through possibilities the way other people ran through emotions. She found herself deferring without resentment. At first it felt like teamwork. He enjoyed solving. She enjoyed refining. He laid out the structure, she softened the edges. Together, they made something that worked. Friends admired their balance. Family commented on how steady they seemed. Steady became a compliment she learned to wear well. There were moments, early on, when she felt the urge to push back, to question a timeline, to suggest a different approach, but his confidence was persuasive, not forceful. When she hesitated, he explained. When she doubted, he reassured. His answers were logical, well-reasoned, difficult to argue with, unless you were prepared to defend feelings that didn't yet have names. She wasn't. She told herself that love didn't require constant negotiation, that trusting someone else's judgment could be a form of intimacy. She believed that compromise was the evidence of maturity. And in many ways, she was right. But there is a difference between compromise and quiet surrender, and it often takes years to notice which one you're practicing. As his career advanced, his days grew fuller. Meetings replaced meals. Calls interrupted evenings. He moved through the world with purpose, his time increasingly divided into segments that needed managing. She adjusted. She learned his schedule, learned when not to expect responses, learned which conversations were better saved for weekends that often didn't come. When she missed him, she didn't say it directly. She framed it as curiosity. "How was your day?" Or, "Support. I know you're busy." She told herself that asking for attention when someone was working so hard felt unfair. He noticed her adaptability, and appreciated it. He said so often, "You're so understanding," he told her once, kissing her forehead before leaving for another late meeting. "I don't know how I'd do this without you." The words warmed her. They also settled something into place. She began to associate being valued with being easy. Their conversations shifted subtly. Where once they'd explored ideas together, now he brought conclusions. She listened, asked questions, offered affirmation. When she shared concerns, he addressed them efficiently. Like problems to be resolved rather than feelings to be explored. She didn't mind at first. It felt productive, reassuring. It wasn't until later that she noticed how rarely he asked her how something felt after he'd fixed it. There were nights when she lay awake beside him, his breathing steady, her thoughts restless. She would rehearse sentences in her head, testing their weight, imagining how they might land. By morning, those sentences had usually softened into silence. Silence, she told herself, was kindness. She remembered the way her mother used to keep peace, by anticipating needs before they were spoken. By smoothing over tension before it hardened into conflict. She had learned early that harmony was fragile, and that those who preserved it were often praised, rarely thanked. She hadn't realized how much of that lesson she'd carried into her marriage. One evening, years in, they attended a work event of his. Polished, formal, filled with people who spoke the language of achievement fluently. She stood at his side, smiling, listening as he was introduced again and again. Successful, driven, visionary. No one asked what she did. She didn't mind. Not really. She had grown accustomed to being the steady presence beside him. The one who made his world function smoothly. Still, as the night wore on, she felt a faint dislocation, as if she were watching herself play a role she'd never auditioned for. On the drive home she mentioned it lightly, not accusingly, just an observation. He glanced at her, surprised. "I didn't think that bothered you," he said. "You know how these things are." She nodded. Of course she did. That night she lay awake longer than usual, replaying the conversation. She wondered how many times she'd told herself she didn't mind something simply because addressing it felt complicated. She wondered when not minding had become a default rather than a choice. In the years that followed, the pattern deepened. He continued to provide, to plan, to ensure their life remained secure. She continued to adapt, to support, to manage the emotional undercurrents that went unnamed. Neither of them intended harm. Neither of them noticed the imbalance forming. Love, after all, was present. Just organized. She still admired him, still trusted his judgment, still believed in the life they were building. But somewhere beneath that belief, a quieter awareness began to stir. A sense that she was standing inside a structure that protected her while also confining her. She didn't yet know how to articulate that feeling. She only knew that when she imagined the future he described, she struggled to see herself clearly within it. That realization didn't frighten her at first. It simply lingered, like a question waiting for the right moment to be asked. The shift didn't announce itself with conflict. It arrived, dressed as progress. There was a year she remembered clearly, not because anything went wrong, but because everything accelerated. A new role for him. More responsibility, more visibility, more expectations. Their calendars filled months in advance, weekends penciled in like obligations rather than rest. She adapted the way she always had. She learned to eat dinner alone without feeling abandoned. Learned to sleep with the television muted low for company. Learned to save conversations for better times that rarely came. When people asked how things were going, she answered honestly, busy but good, and believed it while she said it. Busy explained a lot. Busy excused distance. Busy suggested purpose. He was building something after all. For them, that was how the language worked then. For us. For the future. For stability. Love became a long-term project, measured in outcomes rather than moments. They still talked, technically. They exchanged information, updates, Logistics. She knew his schedule by heart, knew which meetings mattered, which dinners were obligatory. He knew when she had appointments, knew what needed approving, knew she could handle things. Handling things became her specialty. When decisions came up, he presented options already narrowed down. He valued her input, he said. She believed him. She chose carefully, weighing what mattered most to him against what would cause the least friction. She framed her preferences in ways that aligned with his goals. This felt like partnership. It wasn't until much later that she realized how rarely she asked herself what she actually wanted without adjusting for him first. There were moments, small, fleeting, when the distance pressed in on her chest. When she wanted to stop him mid-sentence and say, "I don't need a solution right now. I need you to stay." But those words felt indulgent, impractical. He was tired. He was carrying so much. She could carry this too. So she did. She began to narrate her own emotions internally rather than sharing them, translating disappointment into understanding, translating loneliness into patience, translating longing into gratitude for what they had. Gratitude was safe. Gratitude didn't ask for anything. The house expanded again. Another move, another upgrade. More rooms than they needed. More quiet. She learned the geography of emptiness, learned which spaces felt warm at certain times of day. She developed routines to give the house rhythm: morning light in the kitchen, afternoon quiet in the study, evenings softened by lamps instead of overhead lights. She told herself she liked order. She did. But she also liked predictability because it required so little from anyone else. One evening, while reviewing plans for yet another renovation, she asked him, casually, whether they could slow down. Slow down how? He asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated. She hadn't thought that far. She just knew the pace felt relentless, that the future kept arriving faster than she could inhabit the present. Just less, she said finally. He smiled, affectionate but puzzled. "This is less," he said. "Compared to where we were." She nodded. The conversation moved on. Later, lying in bed beside him, she stared at the ceiling and tried to name what she felt. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, more disorienting. A sense that she was living in a well-run life that didn't quite include her interior world. She remembered something she'd once believed, that love was a practice, not an achievement. Somewhere along the way, they had started treating it like a completed task. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with sadness. Not the sharp kind. The dull kind that settles in when you recognize a pattern you've been part of creating. She understood then that neither of them had changed suddenly. They had simply continued being who they were, long enough for the gap between them to widen. He planned. She accommodated. He provided. She adjusted. It worked, until it didn't. She fell asleep that night thinking about the future he described so confidently. The milestones. The goals. The eventual rest that always seemed just a little farther away. She wondered, quietly, whether rest was something you reached, or something you practiced. And she wondered what would happen if she stopped waiting for permission to feel the weight of what she was missing. She began to notice how often she used the word fine. It slipped easily into conversation, light and flexible, capable of carrying almost any meaning without demanding inspection. "I'm fine. It's fine. We're fine." The word required no follow-up. It created a smooth surface where roughness might otherwise show. When friends asked how marriage was, she said it with a smile. When family checked in, she said it with reassurance. When she asked herself the same question in quiet moments, she said it with a pause she didn't acknowledge. Fine meant functioning. Fine meant no emergencies. Fine meant no explanations required. She didn't realize how much she relied on that word until one evening when it failed her. They were eating dinner at opposite ends of the table, both distracted. He was scrolling through messages, half listening as she spoke about something small. A neighbor, a passing thought, a detail she couldn't quite remember why she'd started sharing. He nodded at the appropriate moments, murmured agreement without looking up. She stopped mid-sentence. He didn't notice right away. When he finally looked up, he frowned slightly. "Sorry. What were you saying?" She considered finishing the thought. It would have been easy enough. Instead, she shook her head. "It's fine," she said. The words landed differently that time. They felt heavier. Final. He accepted them without question and returned to his phone. The conversation ended, not with conflict, but with efficiency. That was when she understood something new. Efficiency was neutral only on the surface. Over time, it chose sides. In the days that followed, she paid closer attention, not to him but to herself. To the small flinches she'd learned to ignore. To the way her chest tightened when she imagined asking for more time, more presence, more care that didn't come wrapped in solutions. She noticed how often she edited her thoughts before speaking, how she softened statements into suggestions, how she framed needs as hypotheticals, just in case they were inconvenient. She wasn't afraid of his reaction. That was the unsettling part. She was afraid of confirming what she already suspected, that even if she spoke clearly, the language she needed didn't translate well into the systems he trusted. One afternoon, while organizing files in the study, she came across an old photo tucked into a drawer. It was from early in their marriage. They were standing close together, arms loose around each other, both looking slightly unsure and very young. She studied her own face in the picture. She looked open, expectant. Not naive, but unguarded. She tried to remember when she'd last felt that way. The answer didn't come easily. She set the photo back where she'd found it and continued organizing, the task grounding her. There was comfort in sorting, in assigning things to their proper places. It was something she could complete. Something with an end. Relationships, she was learning, were messier than that. That night, she dreamed she was standing in a house filled with rooms she'd never entered. Doors lined the walls, all closed. She walked from one to the next, hand on each handle, unsure which one belonged to her. When she finally opened one, it was empty. She woke with the lingering sense of having missed something important. In the morning, she rinsed the mug as usual. The habit steadied her, but it no longer soothed her the way it once had. Instead, it felt like a question asked repeatedly without answer. She didn't know it yet, but the way she was living, efficient, adaptable, undemanding, was teaching her a lesson she would eventually have to confront. A life can be perfectly organized and still be emotionally uninhabited. And love, when reduced to a plan, begins to ask something back. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to make you wonder how long you can keep saying fine before it stops being true. The money didn't change them overnight. It arrived politely, the way good news often does. Incremental at first, almost modest. A raise here. A bonus there. Enough to ease small worries without altering the shape of their days. She remembers thinking how relieved she felt when they stopped checking prices as carefully at the grocery store. How nice it was not to hesitate before agreeing to things. Comfort felt like progress. As his career continued to rise, so did their standard of living. They moved into a larger home, then another. Each space was quieter than the last, buffered from neighbors, traffic, inconvenience. She learned how to navigate square footage that echoed when she walked through it alone. They bought furniture meant to last generations, art chosen to suggest taste rather than attachment. Everything fit. Everything matched. Everything made sense. People commented on how well they were doing. "You've built such a beautiful life," someone said once, gesturing around the room. She smiled, because it was true in a way that was difficult to explain. The more they accumulated, the easier it became to avoid difficult conversations. Stress could be outsourced. Time could be bought back in pieces. If something felt off, there was always a solution that involved spending rather than speaking. When she felt tired, he booked a weekend away. When she seemed distant, he brought home gifts. When she hesitated, he reminded her of everything they had. He wasn't trying to silence her. He was trying to help, in the language he understood best. She accepted these gestures with gratitude. Real gratitude. She knew how fortunate they were. She knew many people lived with far less and carried far more. That awareness kept her quiet when something in her tightened instead of relaxed. Comfort, she discovered, had a way of complicating honesty. There was a night, years into this new phase of their life, when she stood in a closet larger than the bedroom she'd grown up in. Shelves lined with carefully chosen clothes. Shoes arranged by season. Everything she needed within reach. She felt absurdly small. Not poor. Not deprived. Just contained. She sat on the bench in the center of the room and tried to remember the last thing she'd wanted that didn't make sense financially. The last desire she'd had that couldn't be justified with practicality or improvement. The answer startled her. She couldn't remember. Desire had been replaced by optimization. Wants filtered through usefulness. Even her hobbies had shifted. Things that looked good on paper. Things that filled time productively. There was always a reason. Always an explanation. She wondered when she'd stopped wanting things simply because they moved her. Downstairs he was on a call, his voice steady and confident. She listened from a distance, recognizing the cadence he used in professional settings. Clear, decisive, persuasive. It was a voice the world responded to. She felt proud of him. Truly. She also felt strangely absent from that voice's audience. They still shared a bed. Still shared meals when schedules aligned. Still laughed occasionally, especially when recalling early memories. But laughter had become something they revisited rather than something that happened spontaneously. She noticed how often silence filled the spaces where curiosity used to live. When she mentioned feeling restless once, he suggested a class. When she mentioned feeling disconnected, he suggested a vacation. Each response was reasonable. Each one missed the mark in a way she couldn't yet articulate. She didn't want distraction. She wanted recognition. But recognition, she was learning, required language she had stopped practicing. As comfort deepened, so did her reluctance to disrupt it. There was too much at stake. Too many people who admired their life. Too many assumptions tied up in the way things looked from the outside. She began to measure her feelings against her circumstances, and her circumstances always won. After all, nothing was wrong. That was the refrain she returned to whenever doubt surfaced. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been taken from her. She was safe. She was provided for. She was loved, in a way. Still, there were moments, small, insistent, when the quiet felt less like peace and more like a lid. She sensed that the comfort surrounding her was not neutral. It shaped what could be said. It shaped what felt permissible to feel. And though she couldn't yet name it, a new understanding was forming. Wealth doesn't erase emotional hunger. It just teaches you how to hide it better. She stood at the kitchen window that evening, watching the lights come on across the distant hills, and wondered how something so carefully built could feel so far away from the life she imagined she was living. The question stayed with her long after the room went dark. Comfort changed the way time behaved in their house. Days slipped past more quickly, padded by convenience. Groceries arrived without effort. Repairs were handled by someone else. Schedules were managed by assistants whose names she learned and forgot in cycles. Life ran smoothly enough that friction became rare, and with it, urgency. Urgency had once been how they found each other. Now, there was always tomorrow. When he was late, it wasn't alarming. When plans shifted, it was expected. When conversations were postponed, they were postponed indefinitely. Nothing demanded immediate attention because nothing appeared to be failing. She began to realize that wealth didn't just provide comfort, it insulated them from consequence. If she felt lonely, she could distract herself. If she felt unseen, she could stay busy. If she felt uncertain, she could remind herself of everything that worked. There was always a cushion. She wondered how many truths died quietly in well-cushioned lives. One afternoon, she invited a friend over for coffee. They sat in the sunlit living room, mugs warming their hands. Her friend looked around with admiration, commenting on the space, the light, the sense of calm. "You must feel so settled," her friend said. The word lodged somewhere behind her ribs. Settled implied arrival, completion, satisfaction. She smiled and nodded, because explaining the difference between being settled and being still felt like too much work. As they talked, her friend mentioned a recent argument with her partner. Nothing dramatic, just a disagreement that had lingered long enough to require addressing. She spoke with a mix of frustration and relief. "At least we talked it through," her friend said. "It was uncomfortable, but I feel better now." The words echoed in her long after the door closed. Uncomfortable. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been uncomfortable on purpose. That evening she tried to initiate something resembling honesty. Not a confrontation, just an opening. "Do you ever feel like we're distant?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. He looked up from his laptop, surprised but not defensive. "Distant how?" She searched for language that wouldn't sound like blame. "Like we're managing things well, but not really connecting." He considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I think we're just in a busy season," he said. "It'll slow down." She nodded. She had heard this before. Later, alone in bed, she stared at the ceiling and realized something that unsettled her more than any argument could have. If everything stayed exactly as it was, she wasn't sure she could say she'd lived fully. The thought wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand action. It simply existed, steady and patient. She began to notice how often she used money to soften edges. When a conversation felt tense, she changed the subject. When a feeling surfaced, she justified it away. Comfort gave her 100 ways to avoid listening to herself. But avoidance, she was learning, didn't erase discomfort. It delayed it. One morning, she skipped rinsing the mug. She noticed immediately. The cup sat in the sink, a thin ring visible along the bottom. The sight made her uneasy, as if she'd left something undone that mattered more than it should have. She rinsed it a few minutes later, hands steady, but the moment lingered. It wasn't about the mug. It was about how small her rebellions had become. She understood then that comfort had taught her to be careful, not just with money, but with truth. To weigh every feeling against its potential cost. To choose the option that preserved stability even when it diminished vitality. The realization didn't make her angry. It made her curious. And curiosity, once awakened, was difficult to quiet. That night, she sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, the house wrapped in silence that no longer felt neutral. She asked herself a question she had avoided for years, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wasn't ready to face it. What part of myself have I been postponing? The answer didn't come fully formed. It arrived in fragments, memories, sensations, half-forgotten desires. Enough to tell her that something inside her was still waiting to be invited back into her own life. Comfort had kept her safe. But it had also kept her still. And for the first time she wondered whether stillness, chosen too long, could become another kind of loss. She didn't decide to disappear. That was the story she told herself at first, that it had been a conscious choice, a strategic one, made in the interest of peace. But the truth was quieter, and more unsettling. Disappearance, she was learning, didn't require intention. It required repetition. Each time she swallowed a thought. Each time she softened a feeling. Each time she told herself it wasn't important enough to name. Over time, those moments accumulated. She became fluent in anticipation. She could sense his mood before he spoke, read the day he'd had by the way he set his keys down. If the sound was sharp, she stayed light. If it was slow, she gave space. She timed her questions carefully, framed her needs as observations, avoided words that felt heavy. She called it being considerate. Others called it being supportive. No one called it what it was becoming. There were evenings when she caught herself rehearsing conversations in her head. Full dialogues where she spoke honestly and he listened deeply, where pauses were filled with understanding instead of solutions. By the time she reached the end of these imagined exchanges, the real moment had passed. He would be tired, distracted, already halfway into tomorrow. She learned to adjust expectations before disappointment had a chance to form. This skill served her well. It kept things calm. It kept things moving. It kept her from feeling foolish for wanting what she wasn't sure how to ask for. At gatherings, she became the quiet center. The one who remembered names, refilled glasses, smoothed transitions. People gravitated toward her ease. They thanked her for making things feel comfortable. She smiled and accepted the praise. Inside, something contracted. She noticed it most in conversations with women who spoke openly about their frustrations, who named what hurt without apologizing for it. She admired their honesty from a distance, telling herself everyone had different thresholds, different styles, different needs. She told herself she was simply low maintenance. But low maintenance, she was beginning to suspect, was not the same as no needs at all. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer she hadn't opened in years, she found a stack of letters she'd written to herself before the marriage. Not addressed, not finished, just fragments of thought, written in a handwriting she barely recognized, larger, less restrained. She sat on the floor and read them slowly. They spoke of curiosity, of wanting to be known, of believing that love required risk, not reckless risk, but the willingness to be seen even when it felt uncomfortable. She felt a strange grief reading those words. Not because they were naive, but because they were sincere. She wondered when she'd stop believing she was allowed to take up that much emotional space. That evening she tried something small. When he asked how her day had been, she didn't say fine. I felt a little lonely, she said instead, keeping her voice steady. He looked at her, surprised. Why didn't you call someone? He asked gently. Or go out? The answer made sense. It also missed something important. She nodded, accepting it. The moment passed. Later, lying awake, she realized that she had been teaching him how to love her by what she accepted, by what she translated, by what she allowed to remain unspoken. It wasn't his fault entirely. She had been an excellent student of disappearance, and once you learn how to vanish quietly, it becomes difficult to remember how to arrive. Disappearing didn't feel like loss at first. It felt like efficiency. Her days ran smoothly. Conflicts were rare. Conversations stayed light. She knew which parts of herself to bring forward, and which to keep stored away, like seasonal clothes, not discarded, just unnecessary right now. She told herself that every relationship required adaptation. That love was not about insisting, but about accommodating. She took pride in how little she asked for, how easy she was to live with. Ease became her contribution. What she didn't account for was how absence reshapes identity. There were moments, unexpected, unguarded, when she felt it most. Standing in a bookstore, reaching for a novel she would have loved once. Then setting it back because she couldn't remember the last time she'd finished something just for herself. Watching a movie alone and realizing she no longer knew what kind of stories moved her. Hearing a song from years ago and feeling the ache of recognition without context. It wasn't that she had changed dramatically. It was that she had narrowed. She began to notice how often she deferred instinctively. When asked what she wanted for dinner, she said whatever was easiest. When asked about weekend plans, she waited to hear his schedule first. When friends suggested trips or projects, she checked her calendar before checking her desire. Her wants had learned to stand in line. One evening, while hosting a dinner with colleagues of his, she moved effortlessly through the evening, gracious, attentive, composed. She anticipated needs before they were spoken. The night went perfectly. After everyone left, he kissed her cheek and said, "You're incredible, you make everything work." The praise landed hollow. Make everything work. She smiled, thanked him, and went upstairs. In the bathroom, she looked at herself in the mirror, longer than usual. She tried to see what others saw, capable, steady, admirable. She also saw someone carefully contained. That night she dreamed she was standing in a crowded room, waving to get someone's attention. Her mouth moved but no sound came out. People passed by, smiling, unaware. She woke with her heart racing. In the morning, the dream lingered in her body even as she moved through her routine. The mug, the sink, the familiar motions. She noticed how practiced everything felt, how little presence it required. She wondered when she had last done something clumsily, spoken without editing, wanted without qualifying. The answer scared her. Later that day, she met her sister for lunch. It was unplanned, squeezed into a window that almost didn't exist. They sat across from each other in a small cafe, sunlight cutting across the table. Her sister studied her for a moment. "You seem quieter," she said carefully. The observation wasn't accusatory. It was curious. "I'm fine," she replied automatically. Her sister didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. "You always are." The words were gentle. They landed hard. As they ate, her sister talked about her own life. Messy, imperfect, emotionally loud. She spoke about arguments, reconciliations, uncertainty. There was frustration in her voice, but also aliveness. Listening, she felt a strange mix of envy and relief. Envy for the freedom to feel so openly. Relief that someone else was carrying the weight of naming things. On the drive home, she sat in traffic longer than expected. The delay forced stillness. She turned off the radio and let the quiet press in. A thought surfaced then, uninvited but undeniable. If I disappeared completely, how long would it take before anyone noticed? The question wasn't dramatic. It wasn't self-pitying. It was analytical, the way she had learned to think. She ran through the possibilities. Logistics would still function. Schedules would still be met. The house would remain orderly. Things would work. That realization hurt more than any argument could have. She understood then that disappearance wasn't about invisibility to others. It was about becoming unrecognizable to yourself. That evening she sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, the house quiet in its familiar way. She didn't distract herself. She didn't tidy or plan or optimize. She simply sat. And in that stillness, she felt the shape of her absence clearly for the first time, not as a void, but as a space that had been left unclaimed for too long. The thought didn't yet demand action, but it refused to be ignored. For the first time in years, she didn't try to make it go away. If any part of this chapter felt uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever learned how to be easy instead of how to be honest, then this story isn't just hers. Chapter 5 is about something many people are never taught how to name, how self-sacrifice, when left unspoken, slowly turns into self-erasure. So let me ask you, have you ever made yourself smaller just to keep a relationship peaceful? Share your thoughts in the comments. You never know who might need to hear they're not alone. And if stories like this help you understand love, boundaries, and emotional health on a deeper level, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. This channel exists for people who want stories that don't just entertain, they teach. In the next chapter, something subtle but irreversible happens. She begins questioning her memories and realizes the stories we tell ourselves can protect us or trap us. You won't want to miss it. She had always trusted her memory. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt consistent. It gave her a sense of continuity, proof that the person she had been still existed somewhere inside the person she was now. Memory helped her make sense of choices that no longer felt simple. It softened regret. It justified endurance. Lately, though, her memories had begun to feel unreliable. They surfaced unexpectedly, uninvited, and lingered longer than they used to. Not just the good ones, but the moments she'd skimmed past at the time. The pauses, the hesitations, the times she'd almost spoken and didn't. She noticed this one afternoon while sorting through old photos on her laptop. It was a task she'd avoided for years, knowing it would open doors she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. But the house was quiet, the day unclaimed, and something in her felt ready. The photos loaded slowly, filling the screen with earlier versions of her life. There she was, smiling beside him at a holiday party, arm looped casually through his. Another. Both of them laughing at a beach she barely remembered visiting. A dinner with friends, faces flushed and bright. At first glance, the images confirmed the story she'd always told herself. We were happy. We are happy. But as she looked closer, she noticed details she'd never registered before. Her posture, always angled slightly toward him, attentive. His gaze, often directed elsewhere, mid-thought even in still frames. The way she held herself, open but careful, as if already anticipating the need to adapt. She felt a small disorientation settle in her chest. She wasn't trying to rewrite the past. She just wasn't sure she'd been honest about it. She clicked through more images, slower now. There were fewer candid shots than she remembered. Fewer moments where she appeared unguarded. The realization didn't accuse him. It unsettled her understanding of herself. She closed the laptop and sat back, staring at the wall. Memory, she was learning, was not a recording. It was a negotiation, a collaboration between what happened and what we needed it to mean. She had needed to believe that her sacrifices were mutual, that her adaptability was seen, that her quietness was understood as depth, not absence. What if those beliefs had been less accurate than they were protective? The thought made her uncomfortable, and she resisted it instinctively. She reminded herself of the early years, the long talks, the warmth, the way he had listened. Those things had been real. She was sure of it. But certainty, she was discovering, did not guarantee completeness. That evening when he came home, she watched him more closely than usual. Not critically. Curiously. She noticed how he moved through the house, how efficiently he transitioned from one task to the next, how his attention splintered easily, even in moments meant to be shared. He asked about her day. She answered honestly, but briefly. They ate dinner together, the rhythm familiar. At one point, he mentioned a plan, another future adjustment, another timeline. She listened, nodding automatically, then caught herself. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked up, attentive. Of course. Do you remember that night when the power went out? She asked. Early on. We ate crackers by candlelight. He smiled faintly. Yeah. That was a mess. She waited. He didn't elaborate. What do you remember about it? She asked. He thought for a moment. That the storm knocked out power for half the block. I remember thinking we needed better emergency lighting. The answer wasn't wrong. It just wasn't what she'd expected. She felt something shift, not sharply, but enough to notice. Later, alone again, she replayed the exchange in her mind. She wondered how many moments they remembered differently. How many memories she'd infused with meaning he'd never assigned to them. It didn't mean those moments weren't important. It meant importance wasn't always shared. She realized then that memory had been doing more than preserving the past. It had been filling gaps in the present. Each warm recollection had been a way of reassuring herself the connection still existed, even when it felt distant. Memory had become a substitute for presence. That night, she dreamed of walking through a familiar house where the furniture kept shifting when she wasn't looking. She recognized everything and nothing at the same time. When she woke, the feeling followed her into the morning. As she stood at the sink rinsing the mug, she paused longer than usual. The habit felt heavier now, weighted with awareness. She understood that she had been using routine the way she'd use memory, to stabilize something that was quietly changing. The question forming in her mind was no longer what happened to us. It was this: how much of what I believe is built on what I need to believe to stay? The answer, she sensed, would require more honesty than she'd practiced in years. And once you begin questioning your own stories, there's no easy way back to certainty. After that night, memory stopped behaving the way it used to. It no longer arrived neatly, offering reassurance on demand. Instead, it came unevenly. Some moments sharpened, others faded. The past began to feel less like a refuge, and more like terrain she had to cross carefully, watching where she stepped. She noticed it in conversations. When friends reminisced about shared experiences, she found herself hesitating before agreeing with their versions. Not because they were wrong, but because her recollection carried a different emotional weight. Where they remembered events, she remembered how she'd felt standing just to the side of them. She began to suspect she had always been standing there. One afternoon, she took out the notebook again, the one she hadn't touched in years. She flipped past the old entries, the unfinished sentences, and started a new page. No lists, no goals. Just questions. When did I stop speaking first? What do I assume will happen if I'm fully honest? Who taught me that wanting more is the same as being ungrateful? She stared at the words until they blurred. The answers weren't immediate, but the act of asking felt significant. Like opening a window in a room that had been closed for too long. The air was uncomfortable at first, too cold, too real, but it was air nonetheless. That evening they sat together on the couch, the television on but muted. She watched his face in the shifting light, noticed how relaxed he looked when nothing demanded his attention. This, she realized, was when she missed him most. When he was physically present but emotionally elsewhere. She wanted to reach for him. She didn't. Instead she asked, "Do you ever think about how we used to talk?" He glanced at her, mildly surprised. "We still talk?" "I know," she said. "I mean, really talk." He frowned slightly, not defensively, just uncertain. "I thought we were doing okay." There it was again. Okay. She didn't argue. She didn't correct him. She simply nodded. Later, alone in the bedroom, she recognized something important. He wasn't avoiding the truth. He simply didn't experience the same absence she did. The distance that unsettled her felt neutral to him. Perhaps even peaceful. That realization didn't make her angry. It made her lonely in a new way. She understood then that memory had been doing emotional labor on her behalf. It had carried meaning forward when the present could not. It had filled silence with echoes, bridged gaps that hadn't been acknowledged. But memory, she was learning, was not meant to be lived inside. It was meant to inform, not replace. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual and sat at the edge of the bed, watching the light change. She felt clear in a way that surprised her, not resolved but oriented. Like someone who had finally admitted they were lost and could now start reading the signs. She didn't know what would come next. She only knew this, the story she had been telling herself, that endurance was the same as love, that silence was the same as peace, no longer held. And once a story stops protecting you, you are forced to decide whether to rewrite it. Or finally step outside it. She didn't intend to find it. The afternoon had started with a simple purpose, organizing paperwork that had piled up in quiet corners of the house. Documents had a way of accumulating without complaint, and she had always been good at bringing order to things others avoided. It felt productive, contained, safe. She spread folders across the dining table, sunlight catching the edges of paper. Receipts, statements, contracts, evidence of a life built carefully, deliberately. She moved through them methodically, sorting, labeling, stacking. It was only when she opened a thin folder near the bottom of the pile that something in her chest tightened. Her name appeared again and again. Not written lovingly. Not referenced personally. Just listed. Beneficiary. Spouse. Authorized signer. Line items. She paused, fingers resting on the page. The words weren't new. She had seen them before, signed them before. But something about seeing them all together, stripped of context, reduced to function, felt different now. She flipped through the pages slowly. There was his name, repeated with weight and authority. There was the structure of his world laid out in clean columns and decisive language. And then there was her presence, necessary, included, but oddly interchangeable. She felt a small, sharp grief rise in her throat. Not for the money, not for the security, but for the way her identity had been absorbed into a system that didn't require her voice to operate. She sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. She thought about how often she'd been told she was taken care of. How often that phrase had been used as reassurance, as proof of love. She had accepted it willingly, gratefully. It had sounded like safety. Now, it sounded like containment. She remembered the early years again, how she had felt seen, how conversation had flowed both ways. She compared that memory to the present moment, where her name existed most clearly on paper. The contrast was unsettling. This, she realized, was what it meant to be maintained instead of met. There was no accusation in the thought. Just clarity. She gathered the papers into a neat stack and placed them back into the folder, hands steady despite the shift happening inside her. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't angry. She was noticing. That evening when he came home, she watched him move through the house with familiar efficiency. He asked about her day. She answered honestly. She'd been organizing paperwork. Good, he said. That stuff gets overwhelming. She nodded. There was a moment, brief, charged, when she considered telling him what she'd felt reading those documents. How something in her had recoiled at being so thoroughly accounted for. But the words felt heavy, and she wasn't ready yet. Instead she asked, "Do you ever worry about losing yourself to what you're building?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. "No," he said after a moment. "Why would I? This is me." The certainty in his voice was unmistakable. She smiled faintly. Right. Later, alone again, she returned to the table and looked at the empty space where the papers had been. She imagined her life reduced to its visible parts, roles fulfilled, responsibilities managed, benefits secured. It was a good life by every measurable standard, and yet, something essential was missing from the accounting. Dignity, she realized, didn't appear on ledgers. It lived in being recognized as more than a function, in being known beyond usefulness, in having a self that wasn't quietly absorbed by the structure it helped sustain. She understood then that this discovery wasn't a crisis, it was a reckoning. And once you see the difference between being included and being valued, it's impossible to unsee it. That night, sleep came in fragments. She drifted in and out, her mind returning again and again to the papers she'd handled so carefully. The clean fonts, the precise numbers, the way everything important had been captured so efficiently, except her. She lay on her back, staring into the dark, listening to his breathing beside her. It was steady, untroubled. The sound used to comfort her. Tonight, it only reminded her of how differently they inhabited the same space. She wondered when she'd stopped asking herself whether she felt known. Not loved, known. There was a difference she hadn't always recognized. Love could be generous, even well-intended. Knowing required attention, curiosity, presence that didn't rush toward resolution. She turned onto her side and faced him, studying the outline of his face in the low light. He looked peaceful, earned, as if the world made sense to him in a way it never quite had to her. She didn't resent that. What unsettled her was how easily his certainty had made room for her disappearance. The next morning she woke before him and moved through the house quietly, as she always did. But something had shifted. The silence felt different, not heavier, but more exposed. Less like protection, more like a question left unanswered. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table without opening her phone. Without planning the day, she let her thoughts arrive unedited. She realized that for years she had been measuring her worth by contribution, by how smoothly things ran, by how little friction she caused. She had believed that being essential meant being indispensable to the system they'd built. But systems didn't need dignity. People did. The realization was clarifying in a way that surprised her. Not empowering in a loud cinematic sense, just grounding, like finally understanding the rules of a game she'd been playing blindfolded. Later that afternoon, she met her sister again, this time intentionally. They sat on a park bench, watching children run past, their laughter sharp and unself-conscious. Her sister studied her face. "You're thinking about leaving," she said quietly. The words startled her, not because they were wrong, but because they had been spoken aloud. "I don't know that," she said truthfully. Her sister nodded. "You're thinking about yourself," she corrected. "That's new." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the observation settling between them. "I don't want to be ungrateful," she said finally. "I have a good life." "I know," her sister replied. "But gratitude isn't supposed to erase you." The sentence stayed with her long after they parted. That evening she returned home and noticed small things she'd overlooked for years. The way decisions had already been made before she was consulted, the way updates were delivered instead of discussed, the way affection arrived as reassurance rather than curiosity. None of it was cruel. That was the hardest part. Cruelty would have given her something to resist, something to point to. Instead, she was left with a subtler truth. She had been slowly exchanged for the role she played. She stood in the doorway of the study and looked at the shelves, the awards, the framed milestones, evidence of a life accomplished. A life she had supported, protected, and believed in. She felt pride. She also felt the ache of absence again, clearer now, more specific. She understood then that dignity wasn't about defiance or demands. It wasn't about rejecting what had been built. It was about refusing to disappear inside it. That night, as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror, and held her own gaze longer than usual. There was fear there, uncertainty, but also something else, recognition. She didn't yet know what she would do, but she knew this. A life that accounted for everything except her inner world was no longer enough. And once that truth had been named, quietly and without spectacle, it began to ask something of her in return. She chose the evening carefully, not because she was calculating an outcome, but because she wanted the moment to be honest, unrushed, undistracted. She waited until the house was quiet, until dinner had been cleared and the last notification on his phone had gone unanswered long enough to suggest it could wait. They sat across from each other at the table, the same one where paperwork and plans so often spread out between them. Tonight, it was empty. That felt symbolic in a way she didn't comment on. "I want to talk," she said. He looked up immediately. Concern flickered across his face. Not alarm, not defensiveness. Just attention. "Okay," he said. "What's going on?" She folded her hands together to keep them steady. She had rehearsed this moment in her head many times, but now that it was here, the words felt different. Heavier. More precise. "I've been feeling unseen," she said slowly. "Not recently, not suddenly, just over time." He listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. That alone would have been enough once. Tonight, she needed more than listening. "I know you work hard," she continued. "I know you care. This isn't about blame. It's about how I've been shrinking to fit into a life that works very well on paper." He frowned slightly, trying to follow. "I didn't know you felt that way." "I know," she said. The word came easily. "I didn't say it." They sat in the quiet that followed, the space between them charged, but calm. She noticed how much effort it took not to soften her truth, not to rush toward reassurance for his sake. "I miss myself," she said finally. "And I don't know how to stay here without losing more of who I am." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "If something needs to change," he said, "we can change it. I can make more time, we can go to therapy. Whatever you need." The response was immediate, efficient, familiar. She felt the old reflex rise, the urge to agree, to be grateful, to accept the solution and move on. Instead, she paused. "I don't think this is something you can fix for me," she said gently. "And I don't think it's something that can be solved without being fully understood first." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her from a slightly different angle. "I thought you were happy," he said. The sentence landed with unexpected weight. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. She felt something in her chest loosen, not relief exactly but clarity. "I think I learned how to look content," she said. "I thought that was the same thing." He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered the question carefully. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of disrupting what works. Afraid of sounding ungrateful. Afraid that even if I did tell you, we wouldn't be speaking the same language." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I never wanted you to feel managed," he said. "I know," she replied. And she did. That was the hardest truth to sit with. That love could exist alongside harm, that good intentions didn't always translate into understanding. They talked for a long time after that. Not in circles, not in arguments, just in careful, deliberate truths. He asked questions. She answered them honestly, resisting the urge to edit herself for comfort. When the conversation ended, nothing was resolved. But something had shifted. She went to bed that night feeling emotionally exhausted and strangely awake. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different, less padded, more exposed. She understood now that naming the truth didn't guarantee it would be met. It only ensured that she would no longer be complicit in her own disappearance. And once spoken aloud, the truth began to rearrange the future in ways she could no longer pretend not to see. The days that followed were careful. Not cold. Not hostile. Just attentive in a way that felt unfamiliar. He checked in more often, asked how she was feeling, suggested walks, dinners, time carved out intentionally. On the surface, it looked like change. And in some ways it was. She noticed the effort immediately. How could she not? It was tangible, measurable. Calendars adjusted. Calls ended earlier. Presents offered like a gift wrapped neatly and placed in front of her. She accepted it with gratitude. And yet, something in her remained unsettled. It wasn't that his efforts were insincere. They weren't. He was doing what he knew how to do. Rearranging, accommodating, fixing. He approached her pain the same way he approached every problem he cared about, with action. But what she had tried to explain wasn't a scheduling issue. It was an erosion. One evening, they sat on the couch together, a movie playing softly in the background. His arm rested around her shoulders. The gesture was familiar, comforting in its own way. She leaned into him automatically, then caught herself. She wasn't sure whether the closeness felt chosen or expected. "Is this helping?" he asked quietly, sensing her hesitation. She considered the question longer than she meant to. "It helps," she said finally. "But it doesn't reach all the way." He nodded, though she could tell he didn't fully understand what that meant. She wasn't sure she did either, only that something fundamental remained untouched. In the past, this would have been where she stopped, where she reassured him, where she translated her unease into something easier to carry. Tonight, she stayed with the discomfort. "I don't think this is about time," she said, "or attention in the way we usually think of it." "Then what is it about?" he asked, genuinely. She searched for words that felt precise. "It's about being met," she said. "Not managed, not adjusted for. Met." He was quiet for a long moment. "I thought I was doing that," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I've also been teaching you how not to." The sentence surprised both of them. He looked at her, startled but open. "What do you mean?" "I've been editing myself for so long," she said. "So you wouldn't have to slow down. So I wouldn't seem demanding. I don't think you ever got the chance to know what I actually needed." He absorbed that slowly. "So, tell me now." She almost smiled at the simplicity of the request. "That's just it," she said softly. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that fits into how you understand love." The truth sat between them, heavy and unadorned. She saw something shift in his expression then, not defensiveness, not anger, but a kind of uncertainty she had rarely seen. It unsettled her to realize how unfamiliar that look was. "I want to understand," he said. "I just don't know what that looks like." Neither did she. That night, lying awake beside him, she felt the familiar pull toward compromise rise again, the instinct to accept partial understanding and make it enough. She recognized it now for what it was: survival. But survival was no longer her goal. She thought about the ledger, the memories, the years spent being adaptable, grateful, quiet. She thought about how long she had mistaken effort for alignment. By morning, the clarity she felt wasn't dramatic. It was steady. She realized that understanding wasn't something you could negotiate into existence. It required a shared language, and they were discovering, slowly, painfully, that theirs might not overlap enough anymore. That didn't make either of them wrong. But it did make the future she had been living towards suddenly uncertain. And for the first time, that uncertainty felt more honest than the certainty she had been borrowing for years. She didn't wake up one morning decided. There was no single thought that settled it, no final argument, no dramatic realization that split her life cleanly in two. What came instead was a quiet accumulation. A series of small, undeniable truths that lined up one after another, until ignoring them required more effort than facing them. In the days after their conversation, she paid attention to her body. Not in a mystical way. Practically. She noticed how her shoulders tightened when he spoke about the future, as if it were already agreed upon. How her chest loosened when she imagined space, physical space, emotional space, where she didn't have to translate herself. The relief frightened her. Relief wasn't supposed to accompany thoughts of leaving. Grief, yes. Fear, certainly. But relief suggested something had been wrong longer than she'd allowed herself to admit. She moved through the house differently now. Slower. More present. As if she were trying to memorize the feeling of rooms she might not inhabit much longer. She touched door frames, paused at windows, noticed how light fell at different hours. This had been her life. She didn't hate it. That was what made the choice so difficult. He continued trying. She saw it in the way he asked more questions, the way he waited before offering solutions. She appreciated the effort, truly. And yet, each attempt underscored the same truth: he was learning a language too late, and she was no longer sure she wanted to be his teacher. That realization brought guilt with it. She told herself she owed him patience, time, another chance to adjust. He hadn't betrayed her. He hadn't been cruel. He had loved her in the way he knew how. But love, she was learning, was not measured only by intention. It was measured by impact. One afternoon, she sat alone in the study, the ledger folder resting on the desk in front of her. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The knowledge it had given her had already done its work. She asked herself a question she'd been avoiding because she feared the answer. If nothing changed from this point forward, could I stay? She didn't rush the response. She let it settle. She imagined the years ahead unfolding exactly as they were, comfortable, orderly, efficient. The answer came quietly. No. The certainty surprised her with its calm. She felt grief immediately afterward, sharp and real. For the life they'd built. For the version of herself that had believed endurance was enough. For the future she would not live. But beneath the grief was something steadier. Respect. Not from others. From herself. She understood then that dignity wasn't about leaving angrily or proving a point. It was about refusing to keep negotiating her own existence. That evening, she cooked dinner alone. A simple meal. Familiar. She ate slowly, tasting each bite, noticing how present she felt in her own body. The awareness was almost painful. When he came home, she watched him from across the room. He looked tired, earnest, hopeful in a cautious way. She loved him. And she could no longer stay. The two truths existed together, uncomfortable and inseparable. Later, she sat at the table and waited until he joined her. When he did, she didn't soften her posture. She didn't brace herself either. "I've been thinking," she said. He nodded, attentive. "I don't think this is something we can fix," she continued. "Not because we didn't try, but because what I need now isn't something you should have to become for me." His face fell, not dramatically, but deeply. "Are you saying you want to leave?" She inhaled slowly. "I'm saying I need to choose myself," she replied. "And I don't know how to do that while staying." The silence that followed was heavy but clean. No shouting. No bargaining. Just the sound of truth settling into the space between them. She felt her hands tremble slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I don't want to erase what we had," she said. "I just don't want to erase myself anymore." He looked at her for a long time. "I don't want you to go," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. Knowing didn't change what needed to happen. But it did make the leaving honest. And honesty, she was learning, was its own form of dignity. The days between the decision and the leaving felt suspended. Time moved, but differently, slower, heavier, as if every hour were asking to be noticed before it passed. They existed in a shared pause, careful with each other, mindful in a way that was almost tender. They didn't fight. That surprised her. There were moments of grief that rose unexpectedly, standing in the kitchen together, reaching for the same drawer, passing each other in the hallway, exchanging small instinctive smiles that carried history in them. They spoke when necessary, stayed silent when words felt inadequate. He asked practical questions. Where would she go? What would she need? She answered them calmly, grateful for the steadiness. It was the language he spoke best. And in this moment, she let him speak it. At night she lay awake, listening to the house as she had for years. The hum of systems. The quiet competence of everything running smoothly. It struck her then how much of her life had been organized around avoiding disruption. Leaving, she realized, was the most disruptive thing she had ever chosen. She packed slowly. Not everything. Just what mattered. Clothes that felt like her. Books she'd read more than once. Objects with stories attached. Souvenirs from places that held emotion rather than prestige. She left behind things that no longer felt personal. Items that belonged to a version of her who had been trying to fit into something too narrow. The morning she finished, the house felt different. Not empty. Just quieter, in a way that acknowledged change. She sat at the table one last time, hands folded. The mug rinsed and waiting in the rack. The ritual had followed her to the end. When he came downstairs, he stopped when he saw her. "So this is it," he said. She nodded. He stood there for a moment, searching for words that might alter reality. When none came, he stepped closer. "I wish I'd understood sooner," he said. She believed him. That made it harder. "I wish I'd spoken sooner," she replied. They stood there, two people bound by history, unbound by necessity. He didn't ask her to stay again. She didn't ask him to follow. When she walked out the door, there was no dramatic farewell. Just a pause. A shared look. A life acknowledged. The door closed softly behind her. Outside, the air felt sharper. More immediate. She inhaled deeply, feeling the sensation ground her in a way she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt exposed. But beneath the exposure was something else, something steady and unfamiliar. Freedom. Not the loud kind. The kind that arrives quietly, asking you to learn how to live inside it. As she drove away, the house receded in the rearview mirror, still and impressive, holding years of memory within its walls. She didn't resent it. She simply understood that it was no longer hers. And for the first time in a long while, that understanding didn't require translation. The apartment was smaller than she remembered agreeing to. Not disappointingly so, just honestly. One bedroom. A narrow kitchen. Windows that faced a street busy enough to remind her she wasn't alone. The first night she stood in the center of the living room with her boxes stacked unevenly around her, and felt the quiet settle in a way that was unfamiliar. This quiet didn't hum. It didn't feel managed or buffered or designed to impress. It felt lived in already, even before she unpacked. She slept poorly at first. Not because she regretted leaving, but because her body didn't yet trust the absence of routine. There were no systems running behind the walls, no distant mechanical reassurance. Instead, there were sounds, footsteps in the hall, a neighbor laughing too loudly, a car door slamming somewhere below. She welcomed them. They reminded her that life was happening nearby, unscripted and imperfect. Mornings were different now. She woke without anticipating anyone else's schedule. She moved through the kitchen slowly, learning where light gathered, where shadow lingered. She bought a new mug, lighter, unchipped, chosen without explanation. The first time she rinsed it, she noticed how instinctive the motion still was, and she laughed softly at herself. Habits don't disappear just because the reasons for them do. She took long walks without destinations. Let herself linger in bookstores, choosing novels based on curiosity rather than efficiency. She cooked meals that didn't optimize leftovers or impress guests. She left dishes in the sink overnight once and didn't correct it in the morning. The world didn't collapse. There were moments of loneliness. She didn't deny them. They arrived quietly in the evenings, especially when something reminded her of him. A phrase he used, a song they both knew, the memory of a shared joke. She let the grief come and go without negotiating with it. This was what she'd chosen, not happiness guaranteed, but honesty sustained. She spoke with him occasionally. The conversations were careful, respectful, sometimes warm, sometimes awkward. They didn't pretend they were healed. They didn't pretend the past could be rewritten. They spoke as two people who had loved each other sincerely and learned, too late, that love alone wasn't always enough. She noticed something surprising in herself during those calls. She didn't shrink. She didn't edit. She spoke plainly, even when it felt uncomfortable. Especially then. After hanging up, she would sit for a moment and breathe, aware of the space she now occupied in her own life. It felt unfamiliar, like wearing new shoes, slightly stiff, but promising. One afternoon, months in, she realized she hadn't thought about the ledger in weeks. The absence of that thought felt like progress. She wasn't rebuilding herself dramatically. She wasn't reinventing anything. She was simply living in a way that required her presence. And that, she was learning, was more demanding and more rewarding than any carefully planned life she'd known. Chapter 10, Part 2. What Remains. On a Sunday morning, she woke early and made coffee. The light through the window was soft, unremarkable. A day like any other. She stood at the sink and rinsed her mug, feeling the smooth rim beneath her thumb. No chip. No hesitation. The water ran, clear and unhurried. She smiled. The gesture no longer felt like proof of care offered outward. It felt like attention given inward. She carried the mug to the window and watched the street wake up. Someone walking a dog, a couple arguing quietly, a child tugging at a parent's hand. Ordinary life, unfolding without ceremony. She thought about the years she'd spent believing that dignity required justification, that leaving needed permission, that gratitude and self-respect were mutually exclusive. She knew better now. Dignity, she understood, wasn't loud or confrontational. It didn't demand validation. It showed up in small choices, in how you speak, in what you allow, in the willingness to stand by your own inner truth even when it cost you comfort. She hadn't left because he was cruel. She hadn't left because the marriage failed in obvious ways. She had left because staying required a version of herself she could no longer be. That knowledge felt settled now. Not sharp. Not raw. Settled. She still believed in love. She still believed in partnership, in shared lives, in the beauty of building something together. But she also believed, deeply now, that love must meet you where you are, not where you're most convenient. She didn't know what came next. And for the first time that uncertainty didn't frighten her. It felt spacious. She rinsed the mug one last time and set it in the rack, handle turned outward, not because it mattered, but because she liked it that way. Then she turned toward the day, ordinary and open. Somewhere in the quiet of that morning lived the lesson she would carry forward, not as a warning, but as a truth earned gently. Over time, a life can be comfortable without being complete. Love can be sincere without being sufficient. And choosing yourself doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you whole. She stepped away from the sink and into the day, carrying nothing with her but the calm certainty that she belonged to herself. And that, she knew now, was wealth of the truest kind. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or rethink something about love, sacrifice, or self-respect, then its purpose has already been fulfilled. Because this wasn't just a story about marriage or wealth. It was about the quiet cost of silence. And the courage it takes to choose dignity when comfort asks you to disappear. So let me ask you one last question. What part of yourself have you been postponing for the sake of peace? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you value love stories that don't just entertain, but teach real-life lessons about relationships, boundaries, and emotional truth, make sure you subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. This channel exists for stories that respect your heart and your intelligence. Thank you for staying until the end. Stories like this matter because you matter. Until the next one.